and transfer of anti-personnel mines, and on their destruction and the Convention on Cluster Munitions. I also call to all relevant parties to abide by their obligations under the Convention on Prohibitions or restrictions on the use of certain conventional weapons which may be deemed to be excessively injurious or to have indiscriminate effects, and not to transfer or use any mines prohibited by its amended Protocol 2. Madam President, the influx of weapons and ammunition into any armed conflict can contribute to escalation and present significant risks of diversion and proliferation even after the conflict has ended. Measures to address the risk of diversion to unauthorized end users and for unauthorized uses are essential for preventing further instability and insecurity in Ukraine, the region, and beyond. Such efforts will also be key to post-conflict recovery. To prevent the diversion of weapons and ammunition, supply chain transparency and cooperation, and information exchange between importing, transit, and exporting states is required, as well as concrete measures such as marking and tracing, effective accounting and comprehensive record-keeping practices, physical safeguarding of arms and ammunition, customs and border control measures, and diversion monitoring and analysis. The Arms Trade Treaty, the Protocol against the illicit manufacturing of and trafficking in firearms, their parts and components, and ammunition, the Firearms Protocol in short, the Program of Action on Small Arms and Light Weapons and its international tracing instrument, and the Global Framework for Through-Life Conventional Ammunition Management are some of the international arms control instruments established by states to prevent the diversion, illicit trafficking, and misuse of conventional arms and ammunition, and regulate the international arms trade. Therefore, their universalization, as well as full and effective implementation, must remain a priority. Madam President, beyond addressing arms transfers, all parties to any armed conflict have a duty to protect civilians in armed conflict and to abide by their obligation under applicable international law, including international humanitarian law. Parties should also refrain from attacks against critical civilian infrastructure, including energy infrastructure. Since 24 February 2022, the Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights has verified 31,366 civilian casualties, with 10,810 killed and 20,556 injured in Ukraine. The actual figures are likely to be considerably higher. The vast majority of civilian casualties are a result of the use of explosive weapons with wide area effects in populated areas. The Secretary General has unequivocally urged all sides to avoid the use of explosive weapons in populated areas, as such use is highly likely to result in indiscriminate harm and to take combat out of urban areas altogether. I take this opportunity to refer to the political declaration on strengthening the protection of civilians from humanitarian consequences arising from the use of explosive weapons in populated areas, adopted in November 2022. The upcoming first follow-up conference in Oslo is a key opportunity for states to work towards the full and meaningful implementation, and for states that have not yet done so to endorse the political declaration. Regrettably, the use of armed uncrewed aerial vehicles and missiles has ceased to cause civilian deaths and injuries, as well as damages to civilian infrastructure. Just like any other weapons or weapon systems, armed uncrewed aerial vehicles and missiles must not be used in a manner inconsistent with international humanitarian law. Deliberate, direct, as well as indiscriminate and disproportionate attacks against civilians and civilian infrastructure violate international humanitarian law. They are unacceptable and must end immediately. Madam President, distinguished members of the Security Council, the United Nations will continue working towards a just and lasting peace in Ukraine in line with international law, including the United Nations Charter and relevant General Assembly resolutions. I thank you very much for your attention.
I thank Mr. Fung for his briefing. I now give the floor to Ms. Karen Kwiatkowsk.
Madam President, thank you for allowing me to speak. I am a retired Air Force Lieutenant Colonel who began to question the government I served in 2002 as I watched my organization within the Pentagon manipulate information to sell an unnecessary and unjustified war, in that case, the March 2003 invasion of Iraq. I want to make 3 points concerning how Western supplies to Ukraine have been and remain a barrier to peace. First, Western aid and support has enabled war and opposed peace. It is not sent there for Ukrainians, but for a government in Kiev, initially chosen via a State Department and CIA-influenced coup in 2014 to militarily confront Russia. This proxy embraced a kind of Ukrainian nationalism that relied heavily on Ukrainian Nazi ideology. Nazism is publicly rare and always condemned. But in Ukraine, it unified the kind of people who would do what the US and NATO desired. Therefore, history was forgotten, truth ignored, and Ukrainian culture denigrated, because a proxy war to weaken Russia, politically and economically, was desired by some in the West. US senators and NATO leadership continue to celebrate this good investment. Western assistance in weapons, surveillance, and intelligence, as well as diplomatic help, enabled 8 years of Kiev's assault on the Donbass. The Russian military response, no doubt violent, deadly, and in violation of international law, reminds me of several US military operations I supported when in uniform. Except when the US invaded, we discovered later that we were not really there to stop a war, to liberate anyone, to increase their freedom, or ensure their prosperity. Without this Western aid and assistance and unabashed US and NATO hatred for Russia, the Minsk treaties might have been more fully adhered to, and eventual peaceful agreements might have progressed, without war, bringing the blessings of peace and trade. Secondly, Western arms shipments have turned the Ukrainian military into a massive Rube Goldberg machine. What could have been a coordinated and deeply supplied Ukrainian defense operation became reactive, overly complicated, chaotic, and even idiotic. This was predictable. Odd numbers of weapon systems, some defensive, others offensive, many of which required Western maintenance and intelligence inputs were and are used in ways that are wasteful and tragic. Major US and NATO weapon systems have been lost by deploying them into battle operations that cannot fully utilize, maintain, or coordinate them. We have seen tragedy and loss of life on both sides, but the aid-dependent and logistically impaired Ukrainian army has become a slaughterhouse for Ukrainian men, a disaster for their families, over 10 million of whom now live outside of Ukraine and may never return. Kiev's frantic demand for more troops to throw at the front is itself a direct result of past Western military assistance. Western aid, those delivered billions in military and financial assistance, placed Ukraine in a position where it did not seek peace 2 years ago, last year, earlier this year, and where it cannot seek peace today. Why is this? The West, particularly the United States, has cultivated a dependent satrap in the permanent presidency of Mr. Zelensky. Thus, a single rushed visit to Kiev by a former British Prime Minister Boris Johnson could overturn a very possible peace in the late spring of 2022 without a single thought of what may come later. The Western investment has reduced US and NATO stockpiles, and it has also reduced Kiev's ability to negotiate directly with Russia. Western leaders see what they have spent, and they insist on some sort of return. They do not wish to lose their deposit, so to speak. In effect, the West, by proxy Ukraine, refuses a settled peace under the sunk cost fallacy. Third, as billions of dollars of weapons, munitions, supplies, and money entered Ukraine, we observe another Rube Goldberg problem, this time with government accountability. Where does this equipment go, and which bank accounts are fattened? We know, as does Interpol, that small arms and other supplies were diverted around the world, some immediately upon arrival in Ukraine. Ukraine had been known as the most corrupt country in Europe, something that leaders in the West certainly took advantage of when it suited them. 2 years into the war, with half their army dead or missing, we hear stories of widows being sent bills for their deceased husband's uniform to top off an already unbearable grief. Yet Kiev, like the surrounding counties of Washington, D.C., seem to be living well, with luxury cars and stores seemingly untouched by the war. The U.S. is said to be completely financing the government sector of Ukraine, and it shows in Kiev, as my friend Anatol Levin observed last summer during his visit there. Western aid to Ukraine has accelerated poverty and devastation for the bulk of the population and widened the gap between rich and poor throughout Ukraine. There is yet another problem with the massive Western aid to Ukraine. It is jealously viewed by other NATO members as they look over the horizon to some sort of inevitable peace. Massive new US military bases being built in Romania and Poland echo the base building spree the United States embarked upon in the Balkans in the late 1990s and later in the Middle East. Does the US cash flow to Ukraine truly make sense to Poland, Romania, and other NATO members? Western aid has caused NATO division, which has increased risk of escalation and silenced common sense and peaceful voices. What do Ukrainians themselves want? Zelensky was overwhelmingly elected 5 years ago because he promised peace and an end to the war in the Donbass. The West wasted Zelensky's mandate and reversed his every promise. He now begs for dwindling dollars and unavailable weapons systems, arrests people for free speech and journalism, shuts down political parties and churches, and has suspended the upcoming presidential election. Noting the lack of recruits, the shocking decimation of Ukrainian men, and a large Ukrainian diaspora that will never return home, it is safe to say that Ukrainians who once voted for peace want it more today than ever. Instead of what most Ukrainians want, they are getting more weapons. Thousands of US confiscated Iranian machine guns sniper rifles, rocket launchers, and hundreds of thousands of rounds of ammunition were sent to Ukraine just last week. Will this patchwork of loose weapons help Ukraine win? No, it will not. To summarize, Western military aid and money sustains the Ukrainian government and subsidizes its foreign policy. Haphazard Western and NATO aid and the odd set of Western military advisors in country complicated and confused Ukrainian military operations and got more people killed. Former Congressman Ron Paul used to say, foreign aid is taking money from poor people in rich countries and giving it to rich people in poor countries. While not always the case, this sentiment defines the Ukraine project perfectly. Western war aid has ended Ukrainian democracy, divided the Ukrainian people physically and spiritually, impoverished them, and warped their economy. Matthew Ho recently addressed this body, and he accurately and horrifyingly explained the abject devastation to people and the environment done by our Western assistance. We now have the Ukrainian government, presumably with US and NATO aid and assistance, trying to blow up the Zaporizhia nuclear plant to create an even more monstrous environmental disaster than that created by expired US cluster bombs and minefields that litter the land. Conditions for a peaceful resolution have existed for over 2 years now, yet Western aid continues to prolong the war and make it more difficult for Ukrainians to ever return to their homes. We see deliberate destruction of life, property, and liberty in Ukraine. The US government and NATO blames Russia for all of this, confusing correlation with causation. I believe the causation was perfidious Western cheerleading for a proxy war that should never have happened, for reasons yet unexplained, beyond a pressing need for just one more member of NATO. To stop a bleeding wound, one must be still, remain calm, and apply a strong bandage. US and NATO, like an arrogant Nurse Cratchit in the insane asylum, looks at a bleeding Ukraine and says, "Don't be still, fight harder, die more bravely. We will send more money and more weapons." No one in Ukraine and most of the rest of the world believes that this is good advice, because it is not good advice. Thank you for hearing this message and working as individuals and nations for peace.
I thank Ms. Kwiatkowsk for her briefing. I now give the floor to council members who wish to make a statement. I give the floor to the Russian Federation.
Madam President, I don't see, for some reason, our colleagues from the European Union in the chamber. They have, in droves, they sign up for meetings on Ukraine that have been organized by our Western partners. For at least 10 years now, there has been an ongoing methodological influx to the Kyiv regime of Western weapons from the West. Previously, this had been done covertly under the cover of the Minsk agreements. And the relevant activity is something which the West did not advertise, and it even denied this. And now, indeed, this has all come to the surface, and this is no longer being concealed. And so thanks to the high-profile investigations by journalists, we learned that the CIA immediately after the anti-constitutional coup in Kyiv in 2014 unleashed a broad range of investigative centers in Ukraine, which are located directly on the border with Russia. After the beginning of the SMO, all of this provocative activity, to put it mildly, to the against basic logic began to be portrayed as a noble deed. Indeed, what is so bad for many years to arm a state against its neighbor and to encourage an openly hostile policy against it. This is the general customary practice of colonizers who decades have pitted neighbors against neighbors in Africa, Asia, and Latin America. America. They have weaponized them, provided them with weapons, and profited off of the wars. And they did not invent anything new for the 21st century. Today, the victim is Ukraine, and the object is Russia. And therein lies the real subtext of the Ukrainian crisis, which reached the hot phase in February of 2022. Many times we explained why we were compelled to begin the SMO, Special Military Operation, and those who wish to hear us will hear us, and those who do not wish to listen, they will never hear us. And today, however, even Western colleagues are using the words unprovoked increasingly rarely when it comes to our actions in light of what we learned and saw over the past 2+ years about the role of the West in the Western tragedy. This kind of allegations no longer withstand any criticism. Today, the collective West has other concerns. The main concern is to keep afloat the Zelensky posse, which has been losing power in the country at a quick pace and has clearly facing a military defeat. And the Ukrainian marshals' weapons, equipment, and munitions have long been squandered. And although the Western sponsors are finding it increasingly difficult to turn a blind eye to what he has wrought, the influx and the deliveries of these weapons are ongoing. At the same time, it is increasingly difficult for Western elites to pass over in silence information about skyrocketing levels of corruption in Ukraine, the absence of oversight and accounting for the equipment and munitions that are being provided, and consequently, the grave risks of these weapons and munitions falling into the hands of terrorists. All of this unsavory truth is something which they are trying to drown out with the argument that allegedly weapons deliveries are helping Ukraine to uphold its independence in the face of Russian aggression. Is this the truth? What is the present-day Ukraine trying to achieve now? The present-day Ukraine, which for 10 years the West tried to shape into an anti-Russia. We all remember exactly 2 years ago having wrought inhumane and mendacious provocation in Bucha under pressure of its Western sponsors. They squandered its only opportunity for peace at a time when Zelensky trampled upon the Minsk agreements. Western sponsors of the Kiev regime assured him that with assistance from the West in terms of weapons and support, he would be able to vanquish Russia. And this was an illusion that the Kiev leader held onto and clung to for a long time, and now even he recently changed his rhetoric, announcing that Ukraine would lose without Western weapons and without more meaningful intervention. Subsequently, after him in the West, these goals were also reformatted by the West. Their goals were reformatted, and now they sound as this. Like this, to prevent Russia from winning. I'm talking about this in detail in order to illustrate the conclusion of many experts that specifically Western weapons deliveries are preventing the Ukrainian conflict from ending in peace. And this is something which our briefer, Kwiatkowsk, just talked about. If Ukraine had wanted peace, they would have long achieved peace there. Our justified and well-grounded demands to our neighbor, which lie at the heart of the SMO, are well known, and Ukraine can achieve this and meet these demands without detriment to its sovereignty and statehood. Germany was able to end Nazism, and Japan was able to end militarism. This did not result in the disappearance of these states. So why cannot Ukraine do this? Why can't it stop discriminating against the Russian language and Russian speakers and clearly in line with European values? The response to this question is very simple. This is because the Ukraine that would be friendly with Russia is not needed for Washington, London, and Brussels, and this is not why they invested in the country for 10 years. Ultimately, losing on the battlefield, Ukraine is transforming it into an openly terrorist state, and this is something which I wish to dwell on in detail. The Ukrainian armed forces, thanks to deliveries of artillery, munitions, and long-range Western-made missiles, is carrying out attacks on civilian objects within Russia. This is something which we talked about on a number of occasions. In the first quarter of this year alone, the UAF specifically launched 22,000 munitions, claiming the lives of 201 civilians. But this is something that is not included in information from Western media outlets. There has been no condemnation from our Western colleagues about this in this chamber. Suffice it to recall the New Year's Eve targeted shelling of populated areas in Belgorod with the use of the Czech MLRSs, which resulted in no criticism whatsoever from the West. However, this is not enough for Ukraine, and Ukraine has long transitioned to the tactic of terrorist attacks. In this way, the Kiev leadership is trying to divert the attention of its populace from the catastrophic state of the UAF on the front, and it is trying to demonstrate its ability to do damage to the Russian Federation and trying to demonstrate this to its Western sponsors. These are clear crimes by the Kiev leadership, and everybody knows about them, including the murder of the journalist Daria Dugina, of Vladimir Tatarsk, the blowing up of the Crimea Bridge, and the downing of the aircraft with their very own POWs on board. However, in this list, pride of place should be given to the horrific terrorist attack perpetrated on 22 March, targeting the Crocus City Hall in Krasnogorsk. I wish today to share with you the preliminary results of the investigation into this, and I will highlight what is most important. At this juncture, there is no doubt whatsoever about the direct involvement of Ukraine in this vile, inhumane crime. And the traces of those who ordered it, beyond any reasonable doubt, lead to Kiev. Let us recall the chronology of the events. On 22 March, there was a Russian musical group performance that was being planned. 4 terrorists armed with firearms entered the hall right before this performance at 1958, and on their way to the concert hall in cold blood, they fired on innocent civilians who went to the performance. Directly in the hall, they set fire to the seats, and they continued their indiscriminate fire. 13 minutes later, having abandoned some of their weapons, they fled. As a result of the attack in the area, 137 people died, and another 7 people died later as a result of the injuries they sustained. More than 500 people were wounded. All of those complicit in the terrorist attack fled. They tried to reach the border with Ukraine, but they were expeditiously detained after a few hours. They admitted their guilt during the interrogation, and they explained that they were promised $1 million rubles for carrying out the terrorist attack. At this juncture, when it comes to the criminal case, 11 people have been incriminated, 11 perpetrators and participants in this crime. Immediately, incontrovertible facts were unearthed, pointing to the Ukrainian trace and the obvious links of terrorists to Ukrainian intelligence forces. Specifically, according to the murderers telling themselves, they were looking to reach the government border with Bryansk Oblast, after which they would set fire to the vehicles in a forested area, and they would report on this to their sponsor, who would ensure their safe passage to Ukrainian territory, and they would reach Kiev in this way. This similar scheme was used by the perpetrators of the murder of Daria Dugina and Vladimir Tatarsky. The investigation also gained access to telephone data of the suspects, which contained information that incriminated the Ukrainian intelligence services. The investigation also has corroborated data about significant monetary funds and cryptocurrency from Ukraine reaching the perpetrators of the terrorist attack, and these funds were then used to carry out the preparations for the crime. There is also information that the Kiev regime has had long-standing cooperation with Islamic radicals, using this for its purposes. Also, we know about the recruitment work carried out by the Ukrainian embassy in Dushanbe, which is bringing in mercenaries, attracting mercenaries wishing to enter the International Legion. The perpetrators of the terrorist attack in Crocus City Hall and their accomplices are also largely Tajik in origin. In connection with the above-mentioned facts, the Russian Foreign Ministry handed over a demand to the Ukrainian authorities through the International Convention on Combating Bomb Terrorism and the International Convention on Fighting the Financing of Terrorism. A demand was handed over for the immediate arrest and extradition of all persons involved in this terrorist attack. Distinguished colleagues, in all of this history, what warrants separate attention is the fact that 1 hour, literally, after this horrific tragedy in Washington and a number of other Western capitals, they began to heatedly repudiate the participation and deny their participation and involvement in the terrorist attack in Kiev. And this was done before the initial results of the investigation. This was done at a time when there were no allegations yet advanced against Ukraine. Immediately after this, in Ukraine, also preemptively, they hastily sought to deny any accusations of participation or complicity, and Zelensky, in his zeal, accused the Russian authorities of having carried out that attack. We are not saying this. This is what they were saying. We are not shelling the Zaporozhye NPP. They are doing it. We are not bombing populated areas in Russian cities. They themselves are doing this. Russia, this is a false flag operation. When it comes to perfidy, one cannot even imagine anything greater than this. Subsequently, the completely inexplicable began. Washington and its closest allies, who continue to not be able to find the perpetrators who are under their nose when it comes to the blowing up of Nord Stream in September 2022, they began to very nervously and insistently impose upon all the narrative about ISIL having organized a terrorist attack. Subsequently, a video even emerged where its Afghan Vilayat Khorasan cell claims responsibility for what transpired, and naturally this was immediately spread in Western media outlets as the sole version. We still, very seriously, despite the incontrovertible evidence, the smoking gun of complicity of the Kiev regime, they are still trying to convince us that the terrorist attack was ordered not by them, but carried out exclusively by the supporters of radical Islamic ideology. Perhaps somebody very much wishes to force us to believe this, but a number of significant inconsistencies stand in the way. First and foremost, in and of itself, ISIL's claim of responsibility in what carried out does not actually point to its true responsibility. This is a group which previously attempted to take credit for others' achievements, so to speak, apparently trying to remind others of its presence as some kind of an influential player. For example, in 2017, it assumed responsibility for the explosion in storage rooms in the supermarket in St. Petersburg. However, it then came to light that this was done by a mentally unstable person with no ties to Islamists. Secondly, there is a blatant disconnect when it comes to the footprint of the crime. Radical Islamists perpetrate crimes not for money. They are guided by profound convictions when it comes to the state of the world, regardless of how inhumane they may be. At the same time, they do not try to survive. As a general rule, they blow themselves up. For the reward for the martyr's death is something which those who recruit them promise that they will enter heaven and enjoy perpetual bliss. When it comes to Crocus City Hall, we see that the criminals cravenly tried to flee, and they were banking on a new life for the using the profits that they received. One doesn't have to be an expert to understand that when it comes to radical extremists, these were not radical extremists. In addition to all of this, the above-mentioned video was clearly done by an amateur who has no knowledge of Islam or Islamic ethics. We will not conceal the fact that against the backdrop of such assiduous attempts to pin responsibility on ISIL, to at all costs exculpate Kiev, leave the open question of the involvement of Western intelligence when it comes to the preparations for this terrorist attack, especially given that the embassies of a number of Western countries, not long before 22 March, they published information for their own citizens, information with recommendations not to visit areas, densely populated areas in Moscow, specifically concert halls. There are questions which arise given the information about very close cooperation between the CIA and British intelligence with Ukrainian security services, which the heads of the latter boasted about repeatedly. We very much trust that when it comes to all of these questions, we will receive responses to address our concerns. Specifically, the Russian Investigative Committee identified that monetary funds for the carrying out of terrorist attacks on our territory went through commercial companies, including through the oil gas Burisma Holdings company, which operates in Ukraine, and a member of the board since 2014 has been the notorious Hunter Biden. We trust that U.S. colleagues will provide us with all necessary explanations about this. We also trust that Western colleagues will cooperate with us when it comes to the question of detaining those who ordered the terrorist attack in Crocus and holding them to account, as well as when it comes to punishing the perpetrators of terrorist attacks against Nord Stream, which all of our Western colleagues, as was the case with Crocus City Hall terrorist attack, all our Western colleagues categorically condemned both of these. Madam President, the Kiev regime clearly has no plan to abandon its terrorist essence. Just a few days ago, a perfidious attempt was intercepted to bring into Russia 27 IEDs camouflaged as Orthodox icons and vessels for the church. The overall weight of the explosives found in the inspection of the vehicle was 70 kilograms of hexagon. This is enough to destroy completely a 5-story home. It is terrifying to think what could have happened had it not been for the highly professional work of the FSB. When it comes to Kiev's carrying out of terrorist attacks against Russia and the presence of the relevant plans, this is something that was openly, repeatedly announced by the head of the Ukrainian Defense Ministry, Budanov, and the head of security, Mr. Malyuk. To summarize, I wish to tell our Western colleagues the following. In their Russophobic rage, allowing your child, the Kiev regime, to do anything it wishes, you have given rise to a monster. Its activity is no longer limited to Ukraine itself, where the Zelensky party, having usurped power and having quelled dissent, is completely lawless when it comes to its own citizens, openly mocking the memory of the victims of German Nazism and glorifying its henchmen. Its terrorist tentacles are now clearly visible beyond Ukraine. And if today problems in this connection are arising for Russia, this does not mean that tomorrow those tentacles will not reach other areas. For the link to reality is something which the Ukrainian head has already lost and clearly is incapable of sober assessments. You never know. Your Frankenstein may turn on you in your impotent rage from the inability to reverse the situation on the battlefield and in the face of inevitable defeat. And you have provided this monster with sufficient weaponry to do so. Not to mention the fact that self-defense is something which will happen to you and the remnants of your reputation. Recall the prophetic words of the Polish president uttered at the United Nations during high-level week from the rostrum of the General Assembly. The sooner you recognize this, the sooner you rein in Ukrainian clients, the better for you. We're not talking about months here. We are talking about weeks. Thank you for your attention.
I thank the representative of the Russian Federation and pass the floor to the Republic of Korea.
Thank you, Madam President. I extend my gratitude to Mr. Fong for his briefing and take notes of Ms. Kwiatkowski's remarks. And I also welcome the participation of the Ukraine delegation in today's meeting. At the outset, let me begin by reiterating that the international support for Ukraine's effort to safeguard its people and territory is entirely legitimate. As Ukraine is exercising its inherent right to self-defense against Russia's illegal invasion, as enshrined in Article 51 of the UN Charter. In this regard, it is irrelevant that the Russian Federation, which began this war by invading Ukraine, requested today's meeting on the issue of weapons transferred to Ukraine. Rather, military cooperation between Russia and the DPRK would be a more relevant topic today. Just yesterday, there was a General Assembly debate on the Russian veto on the mandating extension of the Security Council's 1718 Committee panel of experts. That veto was cast because Russia didn't like the panel to shed light on Russia's dark spot, the illegal supply of North Korean ammunitions and the ballistic missiles to Russia. The recent report by the panel of experts stated that it was investigating reports on the arms dealings between Pyongyang and Moscow. Madam President, as the war in Ukraine enters its third year, we stand at a pivotal juncture, faced with the choice of upholding our shared principles and global norms or descending into a vicious cycle of escalating violations. Tolerating the erosion of international law and the UN Charter sets a dangerous precedent, promoting the rule of power over the rule of law. These repercussions are compounded by the fact that it is a permanent member of the Security Council who violated the golden rules governing the international relations for decades. In this regard, we strongly urge the Russian Federation to opt for adherence to the UN Charter and the international law, from which it has also benefited by withdrawing its forces from the territory of Ukraine within internationally recognized borders. For its part, the Republic of Korea will continue to stand with the Ukrainian people until they achieve just and lasting peace in their lands. I thank you, Madam President.
Thank the representative of the Republic of Korea and pass the floor to the United Kingdom.
Thank you, President, and I thank Mr. Fung for his briefing this morning. Russia requested this meeting to yet again talk about weapons proliferation to Ukraine. So let's be clear about who is doing what and who is breaking international law and undermining the UN Charter. President, as we are all aware, Russia has repeatedly violated resolutions of this Council by procuring weapons from North Korea and Iran to use in Ukraine. Russia has bought several dozen ballistic missiles and millions of artillery shells from North Korea, which have been used in attacks on population centers across Ukraine. Russia has procured thousands of Iranian Shahed drones and has used them in a campaign against Ukraine's electricity infrastructure, which is intended to beat Ukraine into submission by just depriving its civilians of power and heat. Of course, Russia tries to hide its behavior by vetoing the UN panel of experts, which has provided scrutiny of North Korea's attempts to evade sanctions and advance its weapons program. As many of us said in the General Assembly yesterday, the veto cast by Russia undermined the global non-proliferation architecture, as well as the Security Council. Russia does not listen to this Council, nor to the General Assembly. So instead, let me urge North Korea to stop supporting Russia's unprovoked neo-imperial war of aggression against another sovereign state. President, of course, Russia also does not care about arms control. As well as weapons from North Korea and Iran, it has used Kinzhal hypersonic cruise missiles, dual-capable ballistic missiles, cluster munitions, landmines, and countless more weapons from its arsenal. While Russia might be stripping kitchenware to make its missiles, they nonetheless inflict suffering on civilians across Ukraine. Over 40% of Ukraine's electricity infrastructure has been destroyed, and the ICC has now issued new indictments against Russian military leaders for the campaign of strikes against numerous electric power plants and substations in Ukraine. President, what Russia wants is complete freedom to intimidate, to coerce, and to kill the people of Ukraine. We're talking here about unchecked aggression. This council was created because the world learned the lessons from the first half of the 20th century, that countries cannot be allowed to invade their neighbours and subjugate their people. In that same spirit, global support is helping Ukraine defend itself by providing air defences to protect its cities and its people, and weapons to fight back against the Russian army, an army that has been responsible for summary executions, for torture, for rape, and the atrocities committed 2 years ago in Bucha. President, any country that cares about the UN Charter, the sovereignty of states, and the sanctity of human life should support Ukraine. The UK will remain by Ukraine's side as it fights against Russia's aggression. We will continue to replenish Ukraine's air defences and provide the weapons needed to defend Ukrainian territory. We will do whatever it takes, for as long as it takes, to ensure that Ukraine wins. Of course, Russia could stop this war tomorrow if it withdrew its forces from Ukrainian soil. Instead, it has begun another round of conscription, rounding up its young people and sending them to fight and die in a war of choice. Currently, around 1,000 Russians are being killed or wounded in Ukraine every day. Russia has already suffered 350,000 casualties. This is a tragedy for Russia too. President, the Russian delegation has told us countless lies about this war in this council. But the truth is, today's meeting is perhaps a new low. If I've understood correctly, we heard today from a Russian ambassador that Ukrainians are Nazis acting under the cover of the Islamic State while simultaneously headed by a democratically elected Jewish president. Ambassador, that's quite the combination. And quite frankly, it's preposterous. Thank you, President.
I thank the representative of the United Kingdom and pass the floor to Guyana.
Thank you, Madam President. I thank Mr. Ivor Fung for the briefing and take note of Ms. Karen Kwiatkowski's contribution. Guyana remains deeply concerned about the tragic human toll of this conflict and its devastating impact on regional stability and international security. Each time this Council meets on this topic, the reports of civilian casualties grow even more alarming. At yesterday's meeting, we heard that this war has claimed the lives of more than 10,000 civilians. Equally alarming is that civilian infrastructure, including energy infrastructure, continue to be targeted in a manner that disregards the principles of distinction, proportionality, and precaution. As a result, the scale of humanitarian needs in Ukraine continues to rise, with more than 14.6 million people, about 40% of the country's population, in need of multi-sectoral humanitarian assistance. Guyana deplores the attacks against civilians and civilian infrastructure and calls upon the parties to the conflict to uphold their obligations under international humanitarian law. Madam President, this is why Guyana is extremely concerned about the issue of weapons transfer. We share the view that the supply of weapons and ammunition in any armed conflict situation has the potential to further escalate or prolong the violence and risks diversion. We call upon all parties involved in the transfer of arms to the conflict zone to ensure that the transfers are done in compliance with relevant disarmament instruments and UN Security Council resolutions. We further call for controls to prevent their irregular transfer. As heard yesterday, the territory of Ukraine has turned into a veritable minefield. It is now considered one of the countries most contaminated with landmines and explosive remnants of war in the world. It bears reminding that mines and explosive ordnance pose a threat to civilian lives and well-being, preventing them from accessing critical infrastructure. They also contaminate agricultural lands, thereby contributing to food insecurity in the country. Since Ukraine is a major grain exporter, this can also contribute to global food insecurity. As a state party to the Arms Trade Treaty and the Conventions on Biological Weapons, Chemical Weapons, Anti-Personnel Landmine, and Cluster Munitions, among others, Guyana deplores the use of these weapons and urges full compliance with international law and international disarmament instruments and obligations. In closing, Guyana maintains that the only effective means of preventing further escalation or instability in Ukraine and the broader region is to end this war and to end it through peaceful means. We therefore call for an end to the hostilities and for the parties to commit to a political and diplomatic process toward ending this conflict. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Guyana and pass the floor to Switzerland.
Madame la Présidente, je remercie Monsieur Fung du Bureau des Affaires de Désarmement pour son intervention. J'ai également pris note des remarques de Madame Karen Kwiatkowsk. La dernière réunion de ce Conseil sur le sujet d'aujourd'hui a eu lieu il y a moins d'un mois. La position de la Suisse reste inchangée. L'agression militaire de la Russie contre l'Ukraine viole les principes fondamentaux du droit international. Nous rejetons toute tentative de justifier cet acte et appelons une nouvelle fois la Russie à suspendre ses opérations militaires, comme l'a ordonné la Cour internationale de justice il y a plus de 2 ans. La Charte des Nations Unies nous engage tous à respecter la souveraineté et l'intégrité territoriale des États. Nous rappelons également que l'Ukraine a le droit d'assurer sa sécurité et de défendre son intégrité territoriale et sa souveraineté. Comme nous l'avons entendu lors de la réunion d'hier sur l'Ukraine, cette guerre continue de faire des ravages parmi la population civile. Les attaques quotidiennes dans toute l'Ukraine font de nouvelles victimes et accentuent les difficultés humanitaires, notamment en raison des dommages et de la destruction causée aux infrastructures essentielles. La Suisse condamne toutes les violations du droit international humanitaire et des droits de l'homme. Nous rappelons toutes les parties à respecter le droit international humanitaire et à assurer la protection de la population civile et des personnes hors de combat. En ce qui concerne les transferts d'armes, nous réaffirmons qu'il est essentiel de respecter les conventions et instruments multilatéraux en la matière, y compris les résolutions de ce Conseil. Nous réitérons notre consternation face au non-respect apparent des résolutions applicables par le biais de transferts d'armes illégaux passés et actuels de l'Iran et de la RPDC vers la Russie. Nous regrettons que l'utilisation d'un veto il y a 2 semaines ait mis fin au mandat du groupe d'experts qui soutient le travail du comité 17-18 alors que celui-ci investigue cette question. Enfin, tous nos efforts sont nécessaires pour parvenir à une paix juste et durable en Ukraine, conforme à la Charte des Nations Unies. La justice est un élément indispensable à la paix. La Suisse attache une grande importance à l'avancement des efforts visant à assurer l'obligation de rendre des comptes pour les atrocités commises en Ukraine. Je vous remercie.
Thank you. I thank the representative of Switzerland and pass the floor to Japan.
Thank you, Madam President. I thank Chief Yvua Fang and other briefers for their briefings. Yesterday, in this chamber, we discussed the humanitarian crisis caused by Russia's aggression against Ukraine in violation of the UN Charter. Today, Russia once again has criticized the international community's just and legitimate support for Ukraine, while Russia's aggression against Ukraine continues. It is totally unacceptable that the aggressor criticizes the effort to defend. The core fact remains the same. Russia is an aggressor in violation of the UN Charter. Madam President, we would like to reiterate Japan's clear position on the repeated nuclear rhetoric by Russia. As the only country that has ever suffered atomic bombings during war, Japan will never accept Russia's nuclear threat, let alone any use of nuclear weapons. The catastrophe of Hiroshima and Nagasaki must never be repeated. In addition, we once again condemn in the strongest possible terms the transfer of weapons from North Korea to Russia in violation of Security Council resolutions. We continue to monitor closely what North Korea gains in return. Let me also draw Council's attention to another clear violation of Security Council resolutions publicly announced by both sides, a transfer of the Russian-made automobile from Russia to North Korea. Madam President, as we have stressed many times, peace in Ukraine must be based on the UN Charter. This is something that UN member states agree on. To allow Russia to remain in Ukraine's territories it temporarily occupies would be to allow the status quo to be changed by force. It is an outright challenge to the international order based on the rule of law, and any attempt to distract the world attention would not change the reality. This is why we reiterate that an immediate and unconditional withdrawal of Russia is the prerequisite to peace. We continue to stand with Ukraine and uphold international law. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Japan and pass the floor to France.
Madame la Présidente, je
Madame
remercie
President, I
le
wish
secrétariat
to
pour son
thank
exposé.
the Secretariat for
Il y a
this
tout juste
briefing.
24 heures,
Exactly
nous
24
nous
hours ago,
réunissions
we met
pour évoquer le
to
sort des
discuss
civils en
the
Ukraine.
fate of civilians in
Chacun
Ukraine.
aura en mémoire le
Fresh
bilan
in everyone's
accablant des
mind will
frappes
still
menées par la
be
Russie
the
contre les
overwhelming
populations,
toll of Russian
contre les
strikes
quartiers
against
résidentiels
civilians, against
et
residential
contre les
neighborhoods,
infrastructures
and against
énergétiques.
energy
Personne
infrastructure.
ne se
No
laissera
one will
donc
be
abusé
fooled,
par cette nouvelle tentative de la
therefore,
Russie
by this
d'inverser les
new attempt on the
responsabilités
part of
dans
Russia
cette
to
guerre.
invert
Et puisque
responsibilities in
celle-ci a
this
souhaité
war,
une
but
nouvelle
because
fois,
Russia has
la
wished once
14e,
again, indeed for the
aborder
14th time,
la question des
to
livraisons
discuss
d'armes,
the issue of
nous
weapons
devrons
supplies,
une nouvelle fois
we
rappeler les
are
faits.
compelled once again
C'est
to
la
recall
Russie
the
qui a
facts.
choisi de
It
déclencher
is
cette
Russia
guerre
who has
en
chosen
violation de la
to
Charte des Nations
start
Unies
this war
lorsqu'elle
in
a pris
violation of the
l'initiative de
United
lancer
Nations
l'agression
Charter. It did so
à
when it
grande
took the
échelle
initiative
de
to launch
l'Ukraine,
the large-scale
un État
aggression
souverain
against Ukraine,
qui ne la
a sovereign
menaçait
state
pas.
that posed no threat to
C'est
it
la Russie qui
whatsoever.
choisit de faire durer
It
cette
is
guerre depuis
Russia
plus
that
de
has
2 ans.
chosen
Il
to
ne
make
tiendrait
this war
qu'à
drag
elle
on
de
for more
mettre
than
fin au
2
conflit
years. All it
sans
would take would
préjudice
be
pour
for
sa
Russia
propre
to put an
sécurité.
end to this
Il
conflict at
suffirait
no
de
risk to
cesser
its
son
own
agression
security.
et de
It would
retirer ses
suffice
troupes
for Russia
d'Ukraine,
to cease its
comme l'a
aggression and
demandé la Cour
withdraw
internationale de
its troops from
justice
Ukraine.
dès le
That has
16
been
mars
ordered by
2022
the ICJ
et comme l'a
on
demandé
the
également
16th of
l'Assemblée
March
générale des Nations
2022
Unies
and
dans de multiples
has
résolutions.
been ordered too by the
Rappelons
General
aussi,
Assembly
puisque
in
nous parlons de
several
transfert d'armes,
resolutions.
que la
Let us
Russie a
also
choisi de se
recall, given that we're
fournir
talking
en
about
armes
arms
et en
transfers, that
munitions
Russia has
auprès de la
chosen to
Corée du
furnish
Nord.
itself with weapons
Pour
and ammunition
dissimuler tout
from
cela, elle a
North
jugé
Korea
bon
to
de mettre son
conceal
veto
all of the
au
above.
renouvellement
It's
du
chosen
groupe
to
d'experts
cast its
chargé de
veto,
vérifier
blocking
le
the
respect des
renewal of the
sanctions.
mandate of the panel of
La Russie
experts
choisit ainsi de
responsible
s'en prendre au régime
for the
international
sanctions
de
regime.
non-prolifération
Russia has
afin de
chosen
poursuivre sa
to
guerre d'agression
attack
illégale et
the
d'utiliser
international
son statut de membre
non-proliferation
permanent
regime
pour
in order to
récompenser un
continue its
État
illegal
qui
war of
viole les
aggression
résolutions
and
du
use
Conseil de
its
sécurité.
status as permanent member of the
La
Council to
Russie s'est
reward a
aussi
state
fournie
that
auprès de
violates
l'Iran,
Council
qui lui a
resolutions.
fourni des
Russia
milliers
has
de
also
drones
equipped itself with weapons
utilisés dans des
from Iran.
attaques
Iran has
contre
delivered
des
thousands of
populations
drones
civiles en
used in
Ukraine
attacks
depuis
against
le début de
civilian
la guerre,
populations
en
in
violation de la
Ukraine since the
résolution
beginning of the war,
2231.
and that is a violation of
Nous
Resolution
sommes préoccupés par les
2231. We
allégations
are
de transfert de
concerned by the
missiles
allegations
balistiques
of
de
ballistic
l'Iran
missile
à la Russie,
transfers from Iran
qui
to Russia.
représenterait une
That
escalade
such
inacceptable et ne
transfers would
saurait
constitute an
rester sans réponse.
unacceptable escalation
Nous ne
and
laisserons
cannot
pas la
go
Russie
ignored. We
continuer
will not
impunément à s'en
allow
prendre au
Russia
fondement même
to
de l'ordre
continue in full
international fondé
impunity
sur
to
le droit,
attack the very
qui est
foundations of
notre
the
bien
international
commun.
order
Laisser la
based
Russie
on
atteindre
rules
ses
and law.
objectifs
That
adresserait un
order is
signal
our common
désastreux
good.
à
Allowing
tous
Russia
les
to
États
achieve
tentés
its
de
goals would
réviser
send a
par la
catastrophic
force le tracé
message
des
out to all
frontières.
states
C'est
attempted
pourquoi
to
la France, avec ses partenaires, a
redraw
décidé
borders by
d'apporter un
force.
soutien
That is
politique
why
et
France,
militaire à
alongside its
l'Ukraine.
partners,
Nous
decided
serons
to
aux côtés
provide
du
Ukraine
peuple
with
et
political
du
and
gouvernement
military
ukrainien
support. We
aussi
will
longtemps
stand
qu'il le
shoulder to
faudra.
shoulder with the
Nous le
Ukrainian
faisons
government and people for
pour
as
que
long as
l'Ukraine
is
puisse
necessary.
exercer son droit
We
à la
will do
légitime
that so
défense
that
prévu par
Ukraine,
l'article
is
51 de la
able to
Charte.
exercise its
Nous le
right to
faisons pour aider
self-defense
l'Ukraine à
provided for
préserver
in
sa
Article
sécurité,
51
son
of the Charter.
indépendance
We'll
et
do
son
that to help
intégrité
Ukraine to preserve its
territoriale.
security,
Nous le
independence, and
faisons pour lui
territorial
donner les
integrity.
moyens
We'll
d'engager,
do that to give
lorsqu'elle le
Ukraine the means
décidera,
to enter
les
into when it
négociations
deems
qui
appropriate
permettent d'aboutir à une paix
negotiations
juste et
which
durable,
will make it
conforme
possible to
aux
bring about
principes de
a
la
just
Charte
and
et
lasting
droit
peace in accordance with the
international. Je vous
principles of the
remercie.
Charter and international law. I thank you.
I thank the representative of France and pass the floor to Sierra Leone.
Madam President, I thank you for convening this briefing. Let me also thank Mr. Ivor Fung for his briefing, and we note the contribution of Ms. Kwiatkowsk. As the Security Council is once more convened to deliberate on matters relating to the conflict in Ukraine, with this meeting focused on arms supply, it is regrettable that the conflict now spans over 2 years, and it remains a matter of serious global concern. After 2 years of death, destruction, and suffering, the focus must now be on peace. Madam President, Sierra Leone takes note of the differing perspectives presented on the supply of arms, prolonging the conflict with claims of the transfer hindering potential peace initiatives on one hand, and on the other hand, the cited imperative to protect civilians and self-defense. Given the prevailing circumstances, Sierra Leone underscores the importance of adhering to international legal frameworks in all weapon transfers. We reiterate that for any transfer of weapons in conflict situations to take place, it is necessary to conduct pre-transfer risk assessments and end-user verification to prevent diversion of arms and ammunition. In essence, any transfer of weapons must occur within the applicable international legal framework, including relevant United Nations Security Council resolutions. We continue to reiterate the risk and cost associated with the ongoing conflicts in Ukraine that has led to a significant loss of life, destruction of infrastructure, and mass displacement of civilians. The alarming civilian casualty figures and humanitarian crisis, as verified by the Office of United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights, underscores the urgent need for a peaceful resolution of the conflicts. Sierra Leone reiterates its commitment to upholding the principles of United Nations Charter and international law, emphasizing the importance of respecting national sovereignty, territorial integrity, and peaceful resolution of disputes. In closing, Madam President, Sierra Leone calls for an immediate cessation of hostilities, respect for Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity, and genuine diplomatic efforts to achieve a lasting resolution to the conflict, taking into account the legitimate concerns of all parties involved. In making the call for the parties to the conflict to engage constructively in good faith with a view to finding a political and diplomatic solution as envisaged in Article 33 of the UN Charter, we also reiterate our call for the full respect of the national sovereignty and territorial integrity of Ukraine within its internationally recognized borders. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Sierra Leone and pass the floor to the representative of Ecuador.
Gracias, señora presidenta.
Thank you, Madam
Empiezo
President.
por agradecer
I
al
wish to
señor
begin by
Ivor
thanking
Fung,
Mr. Ivor Fung,
jefe de la sección de
the
armas
Chief of the
convencionales de
Conventional
la
Arms
Oficina de
Branch
Asuntos
in
de
the
Desarme
Office for
de las
Disarmament
Naciones Unidas
Affairs.
por su detallada
I thank
exposición
him for his
informativa.
detailed briefing.
Escuché con atención a
I
la
closely
expositora.
listened to the briefing,
Saludo también
and
la
I
presencia de
also
Ucrania esta
welcome
mañana.
Ukraine to
El
this
día de
morning's
ayer,
meeting.
este
Yesterday,
Consejo
this
se reunió
council
para
met
debatir
to
sobre
discuss
las consecuencias
the
humanitarias de la crisis en
humanitarian
Ucrania.
consequences of the crisis in
El Ecuador
Ukraine.
reitera
Ecuador
el llamado a
reiterates
todas
its
las partes
appeal to
involucradas para
all
que actúen
parties
con la
to the
máxima
conflict
restricción.
to act with the utmost
Debe cesar
restraint.
de manera inmediata
We must see
el
the
empleo de armas
immediate
explosivas en
cessation
áreas
of the use of
habitadas
explosive
para
weapons in
preservar la
populated
vida de los
areas to
civiles
protect the
y
lives of
proteger las
civilians and to
infraestructuras
protect
civiles
civilian
en
infrastructure
consonancia con los
in
principios y
accordance with
directrices
the
del derecho
principles and
internacional
guidelines of
humanitario.
international humanitarian law.
Con relación al tema de esta
As
sesión informativa,
regards the topic
el
of
Ecuador
this
cree
briefing,
firmemente
Ecuador
en la
firmly
importancia de
believes in the
observar los marcos
importance
legales
of complying
internacionales
with
que
the
gobiernan la
international legal
transferencia
frameworks
de armas
which
y
govern the
municiones.
transfer of arms
Es
and
necesario
ammunition.
que todos los Estados
All
miembros
member states
adhieran a las
must
resoluciones relevantes del
uphold the
Consejo de
relevant
Seguridad
resolutions of the
y
Security
lleven a cabo
Council
evaluaciones de
and
riesgo
must
exhaustivas
undertake
para prevenir la
comprehensive
desviación,
risk assessments to
el tráfico
prevent
ilícito
diversion,
y el
the
mal
illicit
uso de
trafficking
armas.
of and the misuse
En
of
ese
weapons.
contexto,
Against this backdrop,
enfatizo la
I
importancia de
emphasize the
respetar
importance of
estrictamente los
strictly
estándares de
adhering
marcación,
to marking,
registro y trazabilidad de armas y
registration and
municiones.
traceability standards
Cualquier
for weapons
distribución
and
de armamento
ammunition. Any
se debe realizar dentro de
distribution
los
of
límites del
arms
marco
must
legal internacional internacional
occur
aplicable
within
y estar
the
condicionada a los
applicable
mecanismos de
legal
garantía que
framework
aseguren la
internationally
adherencia a los
and
principios
must be
fundamentales de
underpinned by
distinción,
guarantee mechanisms
proporcionalidad
which
y
ensure
precaución en su
compliance with
uso.
the fundamental principles of
El uso de
distinction,
minas
proportionality and
antipersonales
precaution
y
in their use,
municiones del
the
racimo,
use of
con su
anti-personnel
impacto
mines and
duradero e
cluster munitions with
indiscriminado
their
en las poblaciones
lasting and
civiles,
indiscriminate
es
impact on civilians is
particularmente
particularly
reprochable y debe
reprehensible
cesar
and must
inmediatamente.
cease immediately.
Señora Presidenta,
Madam President,
la escalada de
the
violencia y el
escalation of
potencial de
violence
desviación de
and
armas
the
exacerba el
potential for
sufrimiento de
weapons
aquellos
to be
directamente
diverted
afectados y
exacerbates
puede
the suffering
plantear
of those
riesgos para la
directly
paz
affected
y la
and may
seguridad
pose
regionales y
risks to
globales.
regional and global
Al
peace and
reflexionar
security. As
sobre
we
el elevado
reflect
costo
upon
humano
the
de este
high human
conflicto,
toll of this
con miles de
conflict,
muertos y
with
heridos,
thousands dead
la
and wounded,
urgencia de una
the
resolución
urgent need
pacífica
for a peaceful
nunca ha sido
resolution
más
to the
evidente.
conflict has never been
El
more
Ecuador hace
resoundingly
votos
clear.
para que se retome el diálogo
Ecuador hopes
constructivo
that we will see
y se
the
utilicen
resumption of
todos los medios
constructive
disponibles
dialogue,
para
and we
avanzar
hope all
hacia una
means
paz
available
justa
will
y
be
duradera,
used to move
siempre
towards a
sobre la
just and
base de los
lasting peace, built
principios de
always
la
on the
Carta de las
basis
Naciones
of the
Unidas.
principles enshrined
Muchas
in the
gracias.
UN Charter.
I thank the
Thank you.
representative of Ecuador and pass the floor to Algeria.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I also take Mr. Ivo Frank for his briefing. I listened carefully to Madam Karen Kwiatkowsk. The use or threat of use of weapons and ammunition with increasing lethality and destructive power in this conflict has been and remain source of deep concern. Weapons and ammunition flows into conflict area may pose the risk of proliferation and is likely to undermine efforts toward achieving a peaceful solution. It also represents a high risk of diversion of weapons and ammunition to criminals and terrorist groups. Moreover, Algeria has warned several times about the exacerbation of polarization that lies at the heart of these challenges, as a phenomenon that prolongs this crisis and escalates tensions. This phenomenon is unfortunately leading to more arms flow into conflict zone, which will certainly cause more casualties among civilians, more suffering, and less prospect to a peaceful settlement. In this regard, Algeria once again calls on the parties to abandon the logic of confrontation and escalation and to privilege inclusive and constructive dialogue and negotiations. We also encourage the parties to attach importance to preventing risk of proliferation of weapons and ammunition and do their utmost to prevent that risk. In particular, we urge the parties to prevent them from falling into the hands of criminal and terrorist groups. Algeria steadfastly maintained that the resolution to the crisis lies in achieving a just and lasting peace based on the purposes and principles of the UN Charter and the legitimate security councils of all parties. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Algeria and pass the floor to Slovenia.
Thank you, Madam President. I wish to thank Mr. Fang for his briefing, and I also take note of the statement by Ms. Kwiatkowsk. Madam President, let me make a couple of points on behalf of my delegation. Firstly, as we continue to discuss the issue of arms transfers, we are compelled to return to the same underlying fact. Arms are being supplied in order to support Ukraine as it is facing an unjustified war of aggression. This would not be needed if Russia had not launched its full-scale invasion. Earlier this week, the President of Ukraine would not have called for support in air defense weapons and systems had Russia not aimed more than 80 missiles and drones against Ukrainian civilian and critical infrastructure in one single night. Slovenia will continue to fully support Ukraine's right of self-defense in line with Article 51 of the UN Charter and the applicable international legal framework. Secondly, while we discuss transfers of weapons that are provided to defend the sovereignty and territorial integrity of a UN member, we cannot overlook illegal arms procurements that support Russian aggression against Ukraine. In this connection, Slovenia deeply regrets that Russia has vetoed a technical resolution on the 1718 panel of experts mandate extension. We are deeply concerned over the emergent evidence of Russia's arms arms procurement, including missiles from the DPRK. This is a violation of multiple UN Security Council resolutions adopted under Chapter 7 of the UN Charter and needs to be further addressed. As stressed on many occasions by many in this room, all UN Security Council resolutions are binding and must be fully respected. Madam President, we need to build trust in order to make our future secure. It is therefore important for the Council to engage in bringing peace and security to the Ukrainian people. I thank you, Madam President.
I thank the representative of Slovenia and pass the floor to China.
主席女士，
Madam President,
我感谢通报人的
I
通报
thank。the briefers for their briefings.
乌克兰危机仍在
The
延宕
crisis in，Ukraine
战争已经
continues
造
to
成
drag
太多的
on,
伤
and the
亡。
war has already caused too
向
many
战场持续
casualties.
输送武
The
器，
continued
只
flow
会
of
加剧危
weapons
机
to the
恶化的风
battlefield
险，
only exacerbates the
无
risk of
助于推
worsening
动
of the
局势
crisis
降温，
and does
实
not
现停火
contribute
止
to
战。
the de-escalation of the situation,
让枪炮来结束
realization
战
of a
争，
ceasefire, or an
不
ending
如由
to
谈
the
判
fighting.
来结束战
It
争。
is better to end the war through
中方再次
negotiations
呼吁
rather than
有
through
关各方
gunfires.
本着负责
China
任的
once
态
again
度，
calls on
加
all
大停
parties
火止战
concerned
的外
to,
交
in
努
a
力，
responsible manner,
推动危机早
intensify
日
their
政治解
diplomatic
决，
efforts for
让和
ceasefire
平的曙光
and put an
早
end
日
to
到
the
来。
fighting so as to promote an early
乌
political
克兰危
settlement of
机
the
有着
crisis and
复
bring
杂的
about an
历史
early
经纬
dawn
和
of
现实
peace.
原因，
The crisis in Ukraine has
本质
complex
是欧洲
historical
安全
and
矛盾的
practical
大
causes.
爆发。
In essence, it is a major
中
outbreak
方
of
不是
security
危机的
conflicts
制
in
造者，
Europe.
也不是
China
冲
is
突的
not the
当事方，
manufacturer of the crisis
没有
nor a
向
party to
冲
the
突任
conflict.
何一方
We have not
提
provided
供致
lethal
命性
weapons
的
or
武器
equipment
装
to
备，
any of the parties to
没
conflict,
有
nor
也
have we
不会
done or will
做
do
从中
anything
渔
to
利的事
profit
情。
from the crisis.
中方在乌克兰问题上的
China's
立场
position
一
on the
贯
Ukrainian
明
issue
确，
has always been
始
consistent
终
and
坚持
clear.
做
It
和
has
平的
always
倡导
insisted
者
on being an
和谈的
advocate for
推动
peace
者。
and a promoter of peace talks.
中方支持适
China
时召开
supports the
俄乌
timely
双方认
convening
可、
of an
各
international
方
conference
平等参与、
recognized by both
公
Russia and
平讨
Ukraine
论
with equal
所有和
participation
平
of
方
all
案的国
parties
际会
to
议，
discuss all peace
无论
options
是一
in a
轨
fair manner.
还是
Both
二
track
轨都
1
可以
and
探
track
讨。
2 can be explored.
我们愿为俄乌
We
双
are
方
ready
开
to
展谈
provide the
判，
necessary
提供必
conditions
要的
for
条
Russia
件，
and Ukraine to conduct
为危机早日
negotiations
实现
and
政
will
治解
make
决
unremitting efforts to achieve
做
an
出不
early
懈努力。
political settlement of the crisis.
谢谢主席。
Thank you, President.
I thank representative of China and pass the floor to Mozambique.
Thank you, Madam President. Allow me to start by thanking the Presidency for convening this important briefing. I also thank the briefers for their insightful contributions. I acknowledge the presence of the representative of Ukraine in this meeting. Madam President, we have closely following the developments in Ukraine with deep concern. Since the outbreak of this conflict, this Council has convened multiple times to address the same issue. Yet, the warring parts have remained inflexible, adhering to a military logic that has proven unrealistic and unsustainable. A shift toward more cooperative and sustainable solutions is the requisite for lasting peace. We believe that finding credible and committed solutions to silencing the guns in Ukraine should be the main issue on the table. Mozambique is deeply alarmed that the current trajectory could lead to strategic miscalculation, potentially engulfing Europe and beyond in a wider conflict. We firmly believe that the massive deployment of arms into this raging confrontation is only exacerbating the situation and undermining the prospect for a peaceful settlement. The increased supply of arms and prospect for a peaceful settlement are fundamentally incompatible. While we recognize the sovereign right to self-defense, we also underscore the importance of responsible arms transfer within the existing international legal framework. With that in mind, we call on all states that have not yet done so to adhere to all relevant international instruments, such as the UN Register of Conventional Arms, the Arms Trade Treaty, the Firearms Protocol, the Programme of Action on Small Arms and Light Weapons, amongst others, to bring greater transparency and accountability to the flow of weapons. Madam President, embracing diplomacy for peace is critical at this juncture. Mozambique firmly advocates for political and negotiated solutions as the only viable way to end this conflict and lay the foundation for lasting and sustainable peace between the two historically sister countries. We therefore call for the re-establishment of diplomatic channels and urge the exploration of all means necessary, including using the UN's Secretary General good offices to end this bloodshed. We implore the involved parties to halt all hostilities, resume direct negotiations without imposing any prerequisites, and actively engage in constructive and meaningful dialogue in good faith. Madam President, the path to peace is arduous, but it is the only way forward. Mozambique stands ready to support all efforts towards a peaceful resolution of this crisis. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Mozambique and pass the floor to the United States.
Thank you, Madam President. And thank you, Chief Fung, for your briefing. Madam President, the Russian representative has again claimed Western assistance to Ukraine provided for its self-defense is prolonging a war Russia started. We all heard the Russian representative say in this council yesterday the only peace discussion it would have was of Ukraine's, and I quote, unconditional surrender. We listen closely to Russia's words, but let us also look at its actions. Russia is committing aggression against a sovereign UN member state. Russia continues to ruthlessly attack Ukraine in pursuit of territorial conquest. Russia has procured ballistic missile launchers and dozens of ballistic missiles from the DPRK in violation of Security Council resolutions. Since last December, Russian forces have used DPRK-supplied ballistic missiles to strike Ukraine nearly a dozen times, firing upwards of 40 DPRK ballistic missiles. Since last September, Russia has procured over 11,000 shipping containers of munitions and munitions-related material from the DPRK in violation of the UN arms embargo on the DPRK. By using its veto against the DPRK panel of experts, Russia is attempting to hide the full extent of its procurement of arms and ballistic missiles from the DPRK for use against Ukraine, undermining this Council's efforts to carry out its primary responsibility for the maintenance of international peace and security. Madam President, Russia also continues to deepen its military relationship with Iran, including through its continued acquisition of armed Iranian UAVs used to target Ukrainian civilians and civilian infrastructure. We continue to be concerned about reports Russia seeks to procure ballistic missiles from Iran. Such an acquisition would represent a significant escalation in Iran's support for Russia's war of aggression. We are also closely reviewing reports Russian forces are using riot control agents and chemical weapons to drive Ukrainian troops into the line of fire. Madam President, the international community has overwhelmingly condemned Russian aggression against Ukraine. As I've said before, Russia can end this war today. The United States remains committed to providing Ukraine what it needs to defend itself. We once again call for Russia to immediately withdraw its forces from Ukraine's territory within its internationally recognized borders and stop its unlawful procurement of DPRK origin material. And with that, I thank you, Madam President.
I thank the representative of the United States. I will now make a statement in my national capacity. I begin by thanking Mr. Fung for his briefing. This is the 14th time that the Russian Federation has requested a meeting on this topic since September 2022. It is therefore crucial to recall the facts one more time. On 24th February 2022, the Russian Federation decided to launch a war of aggression against Ukraine, in violation of the UN Charter and international law. More than 2 years have passed, and this senseless and illegal war persists. It continues to inflict devastating consequences on Ukraine and her people. Today, Russia is once again trying to present the case that the inherent right to self-defense that is enshrined in Article 51 of the Charter, and that applies to all member states of this organization, should be suspended in Ukraine's case. It is trying to convince us that Ukraine is not entitled to receive any assistance from its allies as it desperately tries to protect its citizens and its territory. According to this reasoning, small countries, in this case Ukraine, should simply accept their fate when their larger, more powerful neighbors decide to invade them, attack their cities, and annex their territory. Such arguments are illogical and reprehensible. A world in which might is right is an unacceptable proposition. On this occasion, we once again condemn the massive wave of missile and drone attacks targeting power and essential facilities in Ukraine. These attacks have left more than 1 million people without power these past weeks. We stress, once again, the need for full accountability for all crimes committed against Ukraine. Reports that Russia is using ballistic missiles originating from DPRK in Ukraine are deeply worrying. Such actions are in violation of multiple council resolutions and the sanctions regime which prohibits any arms exports or imports involving the DPRK. We also deplore the use of anti-personnel landmines and the transfer and use of cluster munitions in Ukraine. According to Ukrainian authorities, around 26% of the country's total area is potentially dangerous due to possible mining. We stress that the use of these inhumane weapons has severe and lasting humanitarian consequences. Neither can we forget that Russia's aggression has resulted in over 6.5 million refugees around the world. Another 3.7 million remain displaced within the country. In closing, we reiterate that Russia holds the key to ending this war. It can do right now by withdrawing its military forces from the entire territory of Ukraine within its internationally recognized borders. Until then, Ukraine has the right to self-defense in line with the UN Charter and international law. I now resume my duties as President of the Council. I now give the floor to the representative of Ukraine.
Thank you, Madam President. Distinguished members of the Security Council, Chief of Conventional Arms Branch, whom I'm grateful for his briefing. I also recognize Putin's deputy envoy in the permanent state of the Soviet Union. Apparently, recruiting by the Russian special services of a founding member of the veteran intelligence professionals for sanity has not helped the Russian delegation to deal with their own insanity, judging by their torrent of nonsense about the tragic events at Crocus. We had a substantive and robust discussion yesterday. Wasting resources and time for the Russian propaganda performance today could hardly contribute to fulfilling the Council's mandate. However, the very presence of Russia in this chamber renders fulfilling the mandate impossible. All of you heard yesterday the briefings highlighting the disastrous situation in Ukraine's critical infrastructure following Russian daily strikes. You heard yesterday the update on sharp increase of civilian casualties, including children, across the entire Ukraine. You heard about new war crimes that Russia commits, in particular by executing Ukrainian prisoners of war. I can assure you that nothing whatsoever has been changed over the last 24 hours. Russia bets on a mass terror to break the will of the Ukrainian people over the knee. It is a quote of one of the Russian propagandists I mentioned yesterday. And if Ukraine runs out of weapons, if Ukraine lacks air defense systems, this bet might pay off. Russia will continue its terror unimpeded, declaring every power plant destroyed to be a military object and every child killed to be a neo-Nazi militant. those who fail to distinguish between the defending side and the aggressor, while making out of context calls to stop all arms supplies to the conflict area, should realize the real implications of their starry-eyed position. In the worst-case scenario, it may mean millions of new refugees, hundreds of thousands repressed, and press-ganged to the Russian army for new aggressive wars. In their turn, Putin's allies, such as Iran and DPRK, seem to pay no heed to the Council's meetings on weapons supply and related concerns. They continue to diligently supply the Russian army with missiles, drones, and munition. Iranian drones and DPRK missiles continue to kill Ukrainian civilians. We can only guess at what Russia is offering in turn. The recent veto on the renewal of mandate of the 1718 Committee panel of experts has been just the tip of the iceberg, and apparently not the most dangerous for global security. Therefore, I would like to use this platform, which is broadcast around the world, to reiterate the calls of my president and my minister. We need air defense systems and fighter aircraft to protect our cities from the Russian terror. Once again, we need air defense systems to protect our citizens. We all know where they are. Few dozen air defense systems and a sufficient number of modern jets, and there will be no problem of Russian jets and bombs. We need artillery to move the front line away and to restore normal life in the territories occupied by Russia. And we need accountability in order to prevent the Kremlin from restoring its military potential for new attacks in future. The air shield on Ukraine is absolutely realistic and depends only on the political will of responsible nations. If the solidarity with Ukraine is upheld and strengthened, it will only sober the aggressor. If it is undermined, the aggressor's appetites will only grow. So make the right choice, and I thank you.
I thank the representative of Ukraine for their statements. There are no more names inscribed on the list of speakers. The meeting is adjourned.